From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Friday, November 22. Australia has no capacity to make wind turbines onshore, thanks to cheap Chinese imports, which have destroyed the local industry. That's the claim from manufacturer Keppel Prince, which is mothballing its plant because it says it can't compete with heavily subsidised foreign steel imports. That exclusive is live now at theaustralian.com.au. A heartfelt plea to tackle anti-Semitism from the nation's most prominent judge. Michael Lee of the Federal Court has shared his family's deeply personal story in a powerful call to action delivered on Thursday night. That's today's story. Justice Michael Lee is a titan of Australian law. He's the erudite, funny, razor-sharp judge who presides over the biggest federal court defamation trials. Today we're bringing you something a little different from the judge, a thoughtful, deeply personal speech he made on Thursday night to a dinner hosted by the charity Jewish House. Jewish House in Sydney's Bondi started as a drug and alcohol crisis service, and now it serves the whole community, not just people of the Jewish faith, with crisis accommodation and support for people experiencing homelessness, domestic violence and mental illness. The judge started by harking back to a speech he gave 12 years ago at one of Sydney's synagogues. We've used a voice actor to bring you his words.
I remarked that when I was a boy learning public speaking at a Maris Brothers school, I was confident that there were a number of opening words of a speech that I would never utter. One form of opening words was, "I proudly accept your nomination for President of the United States." Another, equally unlikely, were the words I opened with on that occasion, being welcome to my son's bar mitzvah.
For Justice Lee, raised a Catholic in the western suburbs of Sydney, the story of Jewish experience is now deeply personal.
I was introduced to the richness of the Jewish lived experience through my wife's family. When I came into Penny's family, I was accepted immediately and was welcomed into the light and richness of a cultural and spiritual heritage I have grown to love. Incidentally, Penny was also welcomed with open arms and love, and when I told my father I had fallen in love with a girl who was Jewish, his response was to say, "Well, thank goodness she is not a Methodist."
Penny's family were the Landers, a Sydney Jewish family of long standing. Her grandfather, Abram Lander, was born in Belfast in 1902 to a family of Russian Jews who'd fled the pogroms. That is, a wave of terrifying persecution that swept Eastern Europe in the late 19th century. After coming to Sydney with his widowed mum, Abe Lander won a scholarship to study law at Sydney University, and he became the state MP for the seat of Bondi, representing Labor. He was a prominent voice in support of one of the Jewish community's great causes in the post-Second World War era, the creation of Israel through the United Nations General Assembly. Abe Lander rose to be a New South Wales Cabinet Minister with portfolios including Labor and housing. Abe's son, David, Penny's father, was also a lawyer and rose to be New South Wales's Ombudsman and Chief Magistrate. Lee said his beloved father-in-law
suffered the sort of establishment anti-Semitism so common in those days, particularly as the son of a prominent Jewish minister living in the eastern suburbs. In his autobiography, he tells the story of being acutely embarrassed as a young man when the fact of him being blackballed from joining an exclusive Palm Beach surf club became a newsworthy scandal. As it happened, he was put up at around the same time as a man who later was exposed as a notorious sex offender. Unlike David, the pedophile sailed through the election process.
For this family, just getting on with life, the reality of anti-Semitism came crashing home after October 7, 2023, when Hamas fighters swarmed from Gaza into Israel, massacring civilians and taking hostages, including babies and elderly women.
The revelation for both of us since 7 October is the stark and discomforting realisation that despite living our whole lives in this country and thinking we knew it so well, we do not now recognise an aspect of it. Connected to this was the realisation that some people we thought we knew well did not understand or did not want to understand a more complex narrative than that presented by simplistic and historically flawed declamations on social and some other media. Nor were they empathetic to the trauma the events of last year and its consequences have occasioned.
Lee calls it the growth and mainstreaming of anti-Semitism, and his speech is an attempt to suggest how we might, as a community, first understand and then tackle it. Critical to that is how we balance two important values: the right to free expression and the right to live free of anti-Semitism. It's apparently the only kind of racism that has to explain itself. Lee points out that freedom of speech is not explicitly written into Australia's constitution, but is rather understood by the courts to be implied. The Commonwealth has anti-discrimination laws, but they don't explicitly ban racism. What the Racial Discrimination Act says is it is unlawful to do an act in public that
is reasonably likely in all circumstances to offend, insult, humiliate or intimidate another person or a group of people, and the act is done because of the race, colour or national or ethnic origin of the other.
Lee notes that in the recent case of a school student who sued the state of Victoria, the Federal Court's Chief Justice found the state vicariously liable because the school principal had failed to respond adequately to anti-Semitic bullying.
But the law has gone and will only go so far. No one in this room would be under any misapprehension as to the scope of the present problem. When one compares the nation in which I was born with the nation I now see around me, one must conclude that what has occurred over the last half-century amounts to what might be described as a soft revolution in values within numerous institutions, including the universities, unions, the arts, and schools. In universities, it can be seen in courses focused on what is described as critical legal studies, but is most evident in the social science, history, and education faculties. It is a world where the difference between fact and opinion seems increasingly blurred or obliterated. It is a world which so often simplistically divides mankind into the so-called oppressors and the oppressed, and wallows in ahistorical criticism of the achievements of Western civilization, the rule of law, and Judeo-Christian ethics. Influenced by this narrative from the start, it is unsurprising that many students now seem to use school and university to proclaim rather than to learn.
So that's the problem. What does Justice Lee think is the solution? That's after the break. It's not a secret that it's on university campuses where anti-Semitism has been, at times, most visible of all, in encampments of tents daubed with anti-Israel slogans, in protests on the large scale, and the small scale, like the Jewish professors who find themselves sitting behind locked doors to protect them from abuse and harassment from the students who are supposed to show respect. Lee says university leadership is part of the problem, pointing out there were no encampments at Western Sydney University, where he happens to be on the board of the Whitlam Institute, a think tank and public museum devoted to the legacy of former PM Gough Whitlam. Western Sydney University, Lee points out, has the largest Muslim population of any uni in Australia, but it's had a strong stance against anti-Semitism and no encampments. In May, Western Sydney Uni's Chancellor Jennifer Westacott wrote this in an opinion piece for The Australian.
Western Sydney University's position is simple. It is guided by its principles. Our Charter of Academic Freedom supports the right of staff and students to academic freedom and freedom of speech. It requires that freedoms and rights be exercised responsibly, with zero tolerance for anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, hate speech or intimidation.
Western Sydney Uni aside, Lee is concerned anti-Semitism has flourished in higher education, where the CEOs, teachers and politicians of the future are right now being formed.
What this community and all non-Jews of goodwill need to confront is a deep and profound challenge. How to educate and communicate effectively with a generation exposed to a system producing an apparently significant number of future leaders whose lack of a traditional Western historical education is matched by their sense of self-righteousness and their willingness to sprout slogans. This is a worrying combination, further exacerbated by access to a balkanized legacy media and social media, resulting in preconceived notions being reinforced by the like-minded. There are no simple answers, but that does not mean that one must despair.
Justice Lee referenced a former President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, referring in his inauguration speech to 1,000 points of light.
I've spoken of 1,000 points of light, of all the community organizations that are spread like stars throughout the nation doing good.
Bush was talking about those in the community, spread like stars, doing some good. Lee says the Jewish House charity for which he made the speech is a very bright star in that firmament.
Every person of goodwill can be a point of light. Each can do their best to combat the dark forces that have emerged. In our own way, each of us can confront ignorance and play some role in pointing out and combating anti-Semitic prejudice and any conduct contrary to legal norms, prohibiting discriminatory conduct when we encounter it. Let me conclude on a personal note. In a speech made on 28 November 1946 to the Legislative Assembly of New South Wales, Abe Lander, in responding to instances of anti-Semitic rhetoric that were then occurring in this state, said, "I shall treat any attack on the Jews as an attack upon my wife and my children." Although, unlike Abe, I cannot say I spring from your faith, over the sweep of almost 80 years, I can say I feel exactly the same way.
Those were the words of Justice Michael Lee, spoken by a voice actor. You can read more of the speech right now at theaustralian.com.au. Thanks for joining us on The Front. Our team is Jasper Leake, Kristen Amiot, Leah Zamaglu, Tiffany Dimmack, Joshua Burton, Stephanie Coombs, and me, Claire Harvey.